She walked into the courtroom wearing blood-stained scrubs. The judge mocked her until she revealed why. What happened next stunned everyone in the room. This is the story of Naomi Brooks, a 35-year-old ER nurse, and it's one worth following to the very end. Fulton County Courthouse, Atlanta, 8:57 a.m. The gold-plated clock on the wall ticked in chilling precision. The wooden benches were packed, and the air in the courtroom felt thick, weighted down by a solemn silence just minutes before the hearing was set to begin. In the front row sat Naomi Brooks, 35 years old, an emergency room nurse at Riverside Memorial Hospital. She sat upright in a pale blue scrub top, wrinkled and stained with dry blood at the cuffs. Her curly hair was pulled back into a low bun, her face lean and drawn, her eyes shadowed by fatigue, but unwavering in their resolve. She hadn't been home since finishing a grueling 12-hour shift. No shower, no food, only enough time to wash her hands and rush straight here. Today was a custody hearing for her two daughters, Amari, 9, and Lila, 6, after her ex-husband, Marcus Langford, a finance professional who had recently hired a private attorney, petitioned the court to restrict her parental rights. His claims? Emotionally unstable and too busy to be a mother. Naomi had submitted every required document: employment verification, shift schedules, financial statements, and a character reference from her department head. She had evidence. She had witnesses. What she didn't expect was that her appearance, exhausted in faded scrubs, would be the first thing the judge reacted to. The courtroom doors opened, and Judge Eleanor Whitman, 62, stepped up to the bench. Her silver hair was neatly coiled, her beige suit flawlessly pressed. As her eyes swept across the courtroom and landed on Naomi, she paused. "Ms. Brooks," she said, her voice cold, "are you in the wrong place? This is a courtroom, not a hospital break room." Naomi stiffened slightly. "Your Honor, I just finished an overnight shift in the ER. I didn't have time to go home and change." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And you think that's acceptable? This is a custody hearing, not a coffee shop. You come here dressed like this, expecting what exactly?" A murmur rippled through the spectators behind her. Naomi's attorney, Samuel Sam Carter, stood to object, but Judge Whitman lifted a hand. "I will take this into consideration," she said coolly, "when assessing your seriousness as a mother." Naomi lifted her chin, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Her voice was quiet but firm. "This uniform still has the blood of a 6-year-old boy I performed CPR on at 4 a.m. I didn't have time to change. But I did have time to make a choice between saving a life or showing up here with a freshly ironed outfit." The courtroom fell utterly silent. Even the judge said nothing. But Naomi knew. She had just cracked a fragile balance between appearance and substance, between judgment and truth. And the story had only just begun. That single line cut through the courtroom like a blade. "I didn't have time to change, but I did have time to choose between saving a life or showing up here with a freshly ironed outfit." A long silence settled over the room. No more murmurs. No more sideways glances of judgment. Just a steady tick of the clock and a woman standing, exhausted but unbowed. Judge Eleanor Whitman stared at Naomi, as if unsure she had heard her correctly. For a brief moment, the judge's sharp eyes flickered, though her expression remained composed, the practiced stillness of someone who presided over courtrooms for 3 decades. She opened her mouth to speak, then quietly closed it again. This time, there was no immediate rebuke. Naomi's attorney, Samuel Carter, leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "You just said what no one in this courtroom dared to think aloud." Naomi didn't respond. Her hands clasped in her lap, fingers still marked with the faint imprints of gauze and trauma markers. A first-year law student sitting in the back row slowly pulled out her phone, not to send a message, but to start recording. Her eyes glistened. No one in that room truly knew who Naomi Brooks was. They only saw a woman in scrubs, disheveled hair, worn shoes. They didn't know she had worked 6 overnight shifts in the past week. They didn't know she was the one who carried an 86-year-old man to an ambulance because no one else had the strength. They didn't know how many children's hands she had held mid-seizure, or how often she'd been the only person standing between life and death when the ER doctor was tied up in the next room. Naomi didn't justify herself. She didn't cry. She didn't get angry. She didn't beg for understanding. She simply spoke the truth with the same dignity and steady devotion she gave every time she inserted a breathing tube into a patient. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice low and unwavering, "if my child were in critical condition at 4 a.m. this morning, I'd hope someone like me would be there. I didn't choose my job over my children. I chose to be the kind of mother I pray would show up when someone else's child needs saving." There was an audible inhale from across the aisle. Bryce Maddox, opposing counsel, watching as empathy slowly began to spread through the courtroom. The spectators, the court clerk, even the bailiff. People who might have quietly judged her appearance began to sit a little straighter, as if realizing it overlooked something profound. Naomi sat down, hands still folded. In that moment, she wasn't just defending her right to be a mother. She was redefining what it meant to show up with responsibility, with presence, and with love. And while the court had yet to deliver a ruling, the scales of justice had already tilted, just slightly, toward the woman in the wrinkled scrub top. The clip, barely a minute long, recorded by the law student, was already live on TikTok. The caption read, "Nurse shamed for wearing scrubs to court." Her response? A slap made of pure dignity. 30 minutes later, the clip had surpassed 100,000 views. By lunchtime, it had passed 1 million. And by 3 p.m., the hashtag "Let Her Wear Scrubs" was trending nationwide. At that very moment, inside Fulton County Courthouse, Naomi Brooks remained seated at the defendant's table, completely unaware. She hadn't touched her phone, hadn't checked social media. She was waiting for a ruling that could shape the rest of her life. Meanwhile, the words she had spoken were being shared across the country in every format imaginable. "I didn't have time to change, but I had time to save a child's life. I chose to be the kind of mother I'd hope would show up if my child ever needed saving." On Instagram, a female ER doctor reposted the clip with this caption, "I was once questioned for showing up to court in scrubs after a 36-hour shift. Naomi Brooks just spoke for all of us." On Twitter, now X, celebrities began amplifying the video. A CNN reporter tweeted, "It's not about the outfit. It's a reminder of quiet sacrifice. Listen closely. She didn't speak loudly, but now the entire legal system has no choice but to listen." By that afternoon, the 5 o'clock broadcast on WSB-TV Atlanta ran a breaking segment. Georgia nurse reprimanded for wearing scrubs to custody hearing. Her response silences the courtroom. Naomi had no idea she'd become a symbol. She only knew she was tired, hungry, and needed to pick up her daughter Mila from school at 3:30 p.m. Her worn-down sneakers made no sound as she stepped out of the courthouse when the hearing recessed. No one stopped her, but she couldn't ignore the glances anymore. A courthouse security guard whispered as she passed, "I saw the video. You're truly brave, Ms. Brooks." Naomi nodded politely, still unaware of the magnitude of what had begun. Across the hallway, a group of 3 nurses in matching blue uniforms stood waiting. One of them stepped forward and gently took Naomi's hand. "We're here for you," she said. "That video's everywhere now. But to us, it's not just a moment. It's the truth we live every day." Naomi stopped. Something cracked open inside her chest. Not pressure, not fear, but recognition. For the first time in a long time, her voice, and the voices of people like her, had been heard. And this time, no wooden gavel would be enough to silence it again. When court resumed at 1:30 p.m., the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted completely from that morning. The gallery seats were nearly full now. Strangers who had never met Naomi Brooks had come just to witness the hearing. Several nurses stood silently along the aisle, arms crossed. Not as protesters, but as silent witnesses to a battle far greater than a custody dispute. Judge Lenora Whitmore returned to the bench, her demeanor notably more subdued. There was no rush in her eyes, no condescension toward the woman in scrubs. The plaintiff's attorney, Mr. Bryce Maddox, stood and adjusted his tie, his expression still composed, his gray suit crisp and unblemished. His voice projected just enough for the back rows to hear. "Ms. Brooks, you confirm that you voluntarily accepted a 12-hour shift last night, correct?" Naomi nodded gently. "Even knowing that this morning would be a court hearing regarding the custody of your children?" he continued. "Yes," she answered. "So it would be fair to say," Maddox pressed, "that you prioritize your job over legal preparation for your role as a parent?" For a split second, the room seemed to freeze. A few heads turned toward Naomi, awaiting her response. But Naomi didn't flinch. She sat upright, voice calm but resolute. "No, sir. I prioritize keeping a child alive. A 6-year-old boy who was stabbed in the chest during a domestic violence incident. There was no one else experienced enough to handle the trauma code last night. Except me. I knew I had court this morning. But if it had been your child dying at 3:50 a.m., would you want me to switch shifts so I could show up here in a tailored suit, or would you want to stay with that boy?" Maddox opened his mouth, as if to respond, but Naomi continued. "I did not choose between my job and my children. I chose to be the kind of mother my children would hope to see if someone they loved needed saving. I chose to be a mother who values action over appearance. And I chose to teach my girls that responsibility doesn't clock out." Maddox stood frozen, but Naomi still wasn't finished. "If I hadn't taken that shift, a younger, less experienced nurse would have been forced to handle it. And if something had gone wrong, a child might not be breathing by the time I walked into this courtroom. So let me ask you again, sir, would you prefer I chose this hearing or chose life?" A scattering of applause echoed from the back of the room. Judge Whitmore struck her gavel to restore order, but this time, her gaze wasn't stern. It was contemplative. Just as Judge Whitmore signaled the end of cross-examination, the courtroom doors suddenly opened. Every head turned toward the man who had just entered. Tall, lean but steady, likely in his early 50s, wearing a white medical coat over a crisp dress shirt. On the left side of his chest, a badge read, "Head of Emergency Medicine, Riverside Memorial Hospital." Naomi froze for a brief second. It was Dr. Darius Carter. She had no idea he would come. "Apologies for the delay, Your Honor," he said calmly, his voice steady and clear, eyes focused directly on the judge. "I was called into an emergency surgery early this morning, but when I learned about today's hearing, I felt it was my duty to be present." Judge Whitmore gave a slight nod. "Please state your full name and position for the record." "Darius Carter, age 58. I am the head of emergency medicine at Riverside Memorial Hospital here in Atlanta. And your relation to the defendant, Ms. Naomi Brooks?" "Ms. Brooks has worked the night shift in our emergency department for the past 6 years. She's the first person I call when the case is the hardest, and the last to leave when the work is done." Dr. Darius Carter was sworn in and invited to the witness stand. He carried no notes, no files, just his presence, calm and unwavering. He looked directly at the judge and began. "I've seen many skilled people, many dedicated ones. But Naomi Brooks doesn't just do her job. She does the part of others too, to make sure our patients survive. She's the one holding a seizing child's hand while calling for anesthesia. The one who takes double shift for single-parent nurses and doesn't complain. The one I've watched go 3 weeks without a proper lunch break because she refuses to let our ER go understaffed." He paused. The room fell utterly silent. "Today, Naomi is being criticized for showing up to court in her scrubs," he continued, voice lowering. "But I ask this court, when a woman walks out of a hospital after 12 hours of running codes, cleaning blood, and saying final words to the dying, and still remembers she has a hearing to fight for her children, how is she not worthy to be called mother?" Judge Whitmore looked down, silent. Opposing attorney Mr. Maddox pressed his lips together and looked away. "I didn't come here to argue," Dr. Carter added, his voice unwavering. "I just want to make one thing clear. If I had been a child whose heart stopped at 4 a.m. and Naomi Brooks chose to change clothes instead of staying, then I wouldn't be alive for anyone to argue over custody at all." A faint breath escaped into the silence. No one laughed. No one spoke. Only Naomi, still in her scrub stained with dried blood, looked down at the cold wooden floor, her eyes blurring, not from weakness, but because, finally, someone had spoken the words she never thought she could say herself. And this time, the courtroom didn't just hear her. They listened. The air remained still after Dr. Darius Carter stepped down from the witness stand. Naomi had yet to steady her breath when her attorney, Samuel Carter, rose to his feet. Your Honor, before we conclude our witness testimony, I'd like to submit a letter into evidence, he said, pulling a neatly folded sheet of paper from his briefcase. This is a handwritten note from the parents of the 6-year-old boy Ms. Naomi Brooks resuscitated this morning at 4:17 a.m. in the emergency room of Riverside Memorial Hospital. Samuel walked the letter to the court clerk's desk, handing it over for the official record. Judge Whitmore nodded slightly. You may read it into the record. Samuel turned briefly to Naomi, offering her a glance full of quiet confidence, then began reading aloud. To whom it may concern, we are the parents of Benjamin Taylor, the little boy saved by Nurse Naomi Brooks early this morning. When our son's heart stopped, she was the first to rush into the room. She did not leave, she did not hesitate, and she did not let anyone give up. Because of her, our son is now in recovery, stable and alive. When we learned she left the hospital immediately afterward, without changing clothes, without resting, without eating, just to come here and fight for her right to be a mother, we could not stay silent. If there's anyone who deserves to raise a child, it is someone who never walks away from someone else's. Samuel paused, lowering the letter slowly. The words hovered in the air like a rising tide of quiet emotion. A woman in the back row dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A court clerk gave a slow, solemn nod. Naomi sat still, hands folded in her lap, eyes unblinking, as if fearing that one sudden movement would shatter everything inside her. Judge Whitmore looked up. Her gaze no longer carried the chill it once had. She nodded gently and spoke in a softer tone. The letter will be entered into the official record. Just then, a voice rose from the audience. A young man, slim, with tousled hair, wearing a wrinkled shirt and wide, earnest eyes, stood awkwardly. I'm sorry, I'm a med student on rotation in the ER. I just wanted to say she didn't just save a life. She's the reason I want to become a nurse. He hesitated, then added, I took the afternoon off to be here because I couldn't sit by while someone like her gets judged just for not changing clothes. Judge Whitmore tapped her gavel lightly. Thank you, young man, but this isn't the time for open statements. I understand, he replied quietly, but truth doesn't always wait for its turn to speak in this room. A faint gasp rippled through the courtroom, then silence, as if the air itself was bracing for something irreversible. And Naomi, still in her blood-speckled scrub top, still without a bite of food after 13 hours on her feet, was no longer standing alone. She had the words of her department chief. She had the testimony of a boy who survived. And now, she had a community rising in unison for the truth. The courtroom still hung in the resonance of the patient's family letter and the intern's impromptu words. The air felt suspended. Every gaze fixed on the judge's bench, where Eleanor Whitman sat motionless, her hand resting loosely on the wooden gavel. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was no longer sharp and elevated as it had been that morning. It was lower, steadier, tinged with hesitation, and something more, sincerity. Before we proceed with closing arguments, she said slowly, there is something I need to clarify. The room held its breath. Naomi raised her head, her eyes meeting Eleanor's. Not from someone being judged, but from one human being finally seen by another. This morning, when Ms. Naomi Brooks entered this courtroom, I reprimanded her for showing up in medical scrubs. I accused her of disrespecting the dignity of this court. Judge Whitman paused, drew a slow breath. But I was wrong. Clearly, undeniably wrong. No one moved. I forgot that dignity does not lie in the crease of a blazer, but in the choices we make. In sacrifice, in deciding to save a life rather than wash off the blood, so we appear appropriate for the setting. The courtroom clerk looked up gently. Samuel Carter, Naomi's attorney, gave a slow nod, lips pressed together, fighting emotion. I hereby rescind my earlier reprimand of Ms. Brooks, Judge Whitman continued, and I asked the court clerk to enter that correction into the official record. The quiet rhythm of typing resumed, steady as a heartbeat now finally in sync with justice. And then an unexpected twist. From the back of the courtroom, a door swung open. A man entered hurriedly, clutching a large envelope. His white shirt bore smudges of dried blood and ink. Every head turned. Sorry to interrupt your honor, the man said, his voice firm. "But I think the court needs to see this." Samuel moved swiftly to meet him. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Ethan Marks," the man replied. "I'm the ER tech from this morning. I pulled security footage from the trauma bay. Proof that Naomi Brooks was the one who physically pulled little Benjamin back from the brink at exactly 4:17 a.m. He handed Matt a USB drive. Within minutes, and with Judge Whitman's approval, the video was projected onto the courtroom's main screen. Everyone watched in silence. There was Naomi, drenched in sweat, both hands pressing down on a tiny chest, performing CPR on a bluish, lifeless little boy. She didn't pause for even a second. When the footage ended, the room was utterly still. Judge Whitman placed a hand over her heart. Her eyes were visibly red. "I once believed I understood what responsibility meant," she said softly. "But today, Ms. Brooks, you taught me a different kind of truth, silent courage." She turned to Naomi. "You do not owe this court an apology for showing up in your scrubs. You've shown us something that many people spend a lifetime failing to understand, that sometimes, to truly uphold the responsibilities of a mother, a nurse, and a citizen, you must choose to be your truest self, even in your most exhausted form." No applause followed. None was needed, because truth doesn't need clapping. It just needs to be seen. And in that moment, at Fulton County Superior Court in Atlanta, it was... The courtroom remained hushed after Judge Eleanor Whitman's public acknowledgement and the haunting hospital footage. Naomi sat still in her seat, hands folded in her lap, gaze lowered, but her heart pounded. Not from fear, but from something she'd never experienced before. The truth, finally given space to speak. Samuel Carter rose to his feet and took a steady breath. "Your Honor, I believe my client has nothing further to add. What she's done and how this community has responded speaks for itself." Judge Whitman nodded, then turned to the opposing counsel, Mr. Bryce Maddox, the man once nicknamed the Silver Fox of Southern Civil Courts. Bryce stood slowly. He flipped through a few sheets in his thick case file, then paused and closed it. "Your Honor," he began, voice lower than before, "I respectfully withdraw my previous claim regarding Ms. Naomi Brooks' alleged lack of parental responsibility." A quiet murmur passed through the courtroom. Samuel squinted slightly. Naomi looked up, startled. Then Bryce Maddox turned and looked her directly in the eyes. "In my 22 years of legal practice," Bryce began, his voice quieter than ever, "I've defended mothers who abandon their children, fathers who disappear without a trace, and custody battles driven by revenge, not love. But never, not once, have I felt more ashamed than I do today." He paused, as if swallowing something bitter. "I saw a woman walk in here wearing dusty sneakers and a wrinkled set of scrubs, and I thought, how disrespectful. But now I realize I was the one who was disrespectful. Disrespectful to her profession, her circumstances, and more than anything, her dignity." From the back of the courtroom, someone began to clap softly. A nurse. Then another joined, and another. Judge Eleanor Whitman tapped her gavel gently. "I understand. But please, let's keep order until the end of the hearing." Bryce turned to the judge, and this time, there was no trace of the arrogance he carried that morning. "I have no further arguments. We're not contesting any part of this case." Eleanor nodded. She picked up the court document before her and read aloud, her voice calm and resolute. "After reviewing all evidence, testimonies, and unique circumstances presented in this hearing, this court rules: full custody and care of both minor children shall remain with Ms. Naomi Brooks." Samuel Carter quietly placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder. She didn't cry. She didn't need to, because everything she had fought to protect, her family, her values, her quiet devotion, had finally been seen. Eleanor added, this time not as a ruling, but as something more personal: "Thank you for showing up here as you are, unpolished, unguarded, armed only with courage and the purest love a mother can have." Naomi rose to her feet. The entire courtroom rose with her, not because of court protocol, but out of respect. If you're still following Naomi's story, comment 1 below to let us know you're with her. And don't forget to share this if you've ever witnessed an ordinary person do something truly extraordinary, like she did. Naomi Brooks walked out of Fulton County Courthouse at 3:15 p.m., Spring sunlight glinting off the shoulders of her blue scrubs, still scented faintly with antiseptic. She didn't know that the video recorded at 9 a.m. had already surpassed 10 million views. She didn't know her name was now front-page news from CNN to The Guardian. All she knew was this. 2 little girls were sprinting down the courthouse steps toward her, arms outstretched, and when they embraced her, it felt like the world had been stitched back together by those tiny hands. In the week following the court ruling, hospitals across Georgia began celebrating Brooks Pride Day, a symbolic initiative where healthcare workers were encouraged to wear their scrubs wherever they went, honoring dedication over appearance. At a high school in Ohio, a civics teacher opened class with a simple question. Who here has seen the video of Nurse Naomi Brooks? Every hand went up. One girl stood and said, "I want to study nursing, not to be famous, but because I want to be like her. No excuses, no quitting, just do the right thing even if people misunderstand you." A few days later, Naomi received a handwritten letter from a retired nurse in Nebraska. "You made me cry with pride. I used to think the world had forgotten people like us. But thanks to you, I know we were never invisible." Then came Capitol Hill. A bipartisan group in the Georgia legislature introduced the Brooks Act, legislation ensuring that medical professionals cannot be penalized in court for appearing in uniform directly after a shift. One lawmaker stood and said, "She didn't come to change the law. She came to fight for custody of her children." But her courage changed how we see sacrifice. Naomi didn't speak on television. She didn't accept talk show invitations. She simply returned to hospital at 6 a.m. the next day, where a 6-year-old boy was waiting for his bandages to be changed. She didn't do anything to become famous, but it was precisely her humble, unseen dedication that made an entire country pause and learn how to respect those who quietly keep the world running. 1 year after the trial, on April 15th, the governor of Georgia signed into law the Brooks Dignity in Healthcare Act. From that day on, any healthcare worker summoned to court after a shift will be legally protected in wearing their professional uniform, ensuring their appearance could not be judged without regard for their circumstances. That same day, at the U.S. Museum of Labor and Public Service in Washington, D.C., a new display case was unveiled. Inside it sat a faded blue scrub top, a worn plastic name tag that read Naomi Brooks, RN, Trauma Unit, and a pair of frayed sneakers. Beneath it, a small bronze plaque read, "A uniform that arrived on time, not to be welcomed, only to be respected." Naomi didn't attend the opening ceremony. She didn't care for the spotlight. Instead, she sat quietly on an old couch in her living room, her arms wrapped around her youngest daughter, Lila, as they watched the evening news replay the footage. Her faded scrub now encased in glass beside a 9/11 firefighter's helmet and the jacket of a World War II nurse. "Mama." Lila looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, baby? When I grow up, I want to wear scrubs too, just like you." Naomi pulled her daughter a little closer, a tired but warm smile spreading across her face. "You can be anything you want to be, Lila. Just remember this. Never wear it to impress. Wear it to be ready to do what's right." Outside, the church bells rang 7 times. In homes across America, nurses were tying their shoes, adjusting their name tags, checking their pockets for pens and gloves. They put on scrubs, laced soft-soled shoes. No one would say their names aloud. But tonight, as they stepped out the door, Naomi's shadow walked with them, an unspoken symbol whispering, "Professionalism doesn't live in a collar. It lives in your heart." And for those who had once sat in that courtroom, who watched that video, who cried not because she was perfect, but because she was real, every time they see someone step into a sacred space wearing a faded uniform, they will no longer lift their chins with disdain. They will rise to their feet, because now they know that's someone holding life in their hands, not just on an operating table, but in the beating heart of society that had long forgotten how to look beyond the surface.